Hi, and welcome to Mrs. Long's lesson on chapter 10 of the Picture of Dorian Gray. You remember at the end of the last chapter, Dorian had spoken to Basil, had managed to sort of weasel the truth out of Basil about how Basil felt about the portrait, had managed to not reveal his truth about the portrait, and had sort of decided that it didn't really matter what happened to the portrait because it meant that he would be safe and there would be some almost sort of delightful pleasure in him watching the portrait age and grow ugly as he stayed young and forever, and that was the only thing. He was safe, and that was what was important. So what's happening in this chapter is he now decides that he obviously remembers he thought he was mad to actually have left this portrait out where anybody could have seen it, and so he carries out his decision, and he gets Mr. Hubbard from the man who frames paintings to come and move the portrait for him. And so it's very significant, I think, where he chooses to hide this portrait. So he asks his housekeeper for the key for his schoolroom, where he used to have his lessons when he was a boy. And so what comes up quite often in this chapter is references to his grandfather. And we start to see a little bit more behind the psychology of Dorian and how he grew up. You see here he winced at the mention of his grandfather. He had hateful memories of him. Okay. So he's got to sort of do this very carefully. He has to make sure nobody knows why he wants to go into the schoolroom. Nobody sees the painting, even the men who move it. And so he sees a large satin coverlet, a satin sort of throw that's been embroidered that belonged to his grandfather, and he thinks that would be a good thing to wrap the dreadful thing in. And he muses that it perhaps often had served as a pall for the dead. Now it was to hide something that had a corruption of its own, worse than the corruption of death, something that would breed horrors and yet would never die. What the worm was to the corpse, his sins would be to the painted image. You see here that he has accepted that he's going to sin, and he's accepted that this is going to corrupt and mar and rot this painting. They would mar its beauty and eat away its grace. They would defile it and make it shameful, and yet the thing would live on. It would always be alive. So he knows what he's doing. He's making this cognitive decision that he is going to sin, live a life of hedonistic pleasures, and allow the painting to bear the brunt of it. And it's almost as if he's decided that he knows he's going to do things that are so horrific that it's going to absolutely ruin this beautiful painting of him. He has a moment where he has a second thought. Remember, this painting puts him at a crossroads. Is he going to allow it to be a visible sign of conscience so that he is good, or is he just going to let it bear the brunt of his sin so that he can do whatever he wants? He has decided on the former, but he has a momentary sort of lapse where he regrets that he had not told Basil the true reason, because Basil would have helped him to resist Lord Henry's influence and the still more poisonous influences that came from his own temperament. Notice here his acknowledgement that it's not just Lord Henry, even though he says Lord Henry with his poisonous, dangerous theories, he knows that his own temperament has the ability for worth. Interesting that he acknowledges that. He hasn't, it's still very early on in the story, but perhaps the way he was able to bounce back from Sybil's death has given him some insight into his own character. Yes, Basil would have saved him. I like to think of Basil as the little sort of angel on Dorian's shoulder and Lord Henry as the devil on the other. He knows that Basil's good, and often he doesn't want to listen to Basil because Basil tells him things that are true, and Basil is kind of the voice of reason that he knows he should listen to, but Lord Henry is the voice of temptation that's just too good for him to resist. And he admits that there are terrible passions in him that would find their outlet and dreams that would make the shadow of their evil real. So all of the things that had been kept hidden, he's going to allow to come to light. But obviously only the painting will show the evidence of this. So when he looks, just before he is about to cover the painting, he looks at it, and it seems to him that the painting was unchanged, but his loathing of it had intensified, and so it looked worse than it did before. Only the expression had altered compared to what he saw of it in censure or rebuke. How shallow Basil's reproaches about Sybil Vane. Remember the previous chapter, Basil was shocked that he was not more upset about Sybil Vane's death, was horrified that he hadn't given any thought to her mother, and couldn't believe that this man who was destined to marry Sybil could be so callous and unfeeling and have got over her death so quickly. But compared to the things that Basil said to him, which did make him uncomfortable, the way the portrait looks at him is even worse. His own soul was looking out at him and calling him to judgment. A look of pain came across him, and he flung the rich pall over the picture. So he cannot bear to look at this picture because it's bearing the truth of his soul to him. And interesting, obviously very significant, that he's covering it with a funeral pall, which is the piece of cloth that you would cover a coffin, a dead body. It's almost as if he's burying the man he used to be, the good, innocent, naive, sweet Dorian. When Mr. Hubbard and his men are carrying this massive portrait up the stairs, he says, "It's something of a load to carry," gasped the little man, and he stopped to wipe the sweat off his forehead. And there's this lovely moment where Dorian says, "Yeah, I'm afraid it is rather heavy." But of course, that could have two interpretations. Heavy as in it's physically heavy, but heavy as in it carries the weight of Dorian's sins and the truth of his inner self as well. And he unlocks the door that opens into the room that was to keep for him the curious secret of his life and hide his soul from the eyes of men. So this room almost becomes like a cave in which Dorian's real self resides, and he's going to keep it away from everyone and the prying eyes of everything. It's a large room that his grandfather had built specifically for him, and it talks here about how his grandfather, or why his grandfather hated him, because of his strange likeness to his mother, and for other reasons, probably because he, as we've discussed before, is the symbol of his mother completely disobeying the rules of her class and marrying this lowly foot soldier who he had murdered. And so Dorian is this constant reminder of that, but also remember his mother died, and so the pain that would cause the grandfather would be, Dorian would be a reminder of that constantly. Not only his presence, but the fact that he looks so like his mother. And he references here as well in this extract, every moment of his lonely childhood came back to him. So he was a lonely child, and his guardian, his grandfather, didn't have any regard for him. So you can imagine growing up with very little love and nurturing. He recalls the stainless purity of his boyish life, and it seemed horrible to him that it was here that the fatal portrait was to be hidden away. So it's this sort of very sick paradox, a sick irony, that the place that represents his untouched, innocent boyhood is now going to be the thing that, or the place that houses the horrors of his sinful soul. He talks here about how beneath its purple pall the face painted would grow bestial, sodden, and unclean. But what did it matter? Because no one could see it. He himself would not see it. Why should he watch the hideous corruption of his soul? He kept his youth. That was enough. Now we know he's not going to be able to resist watching the hideous corruption of his soul. But at the moment, he's looking towards a possible more brighter future. There was no reason that the future should be so full of shame. Some love might come across his life and purify him and shield him from those sins that seemed to be already stirring in spirit and flesh. Perhaps someday the cruel look would have passed away from the scarlet sensitive mouth. And so it's interesting how he's relying on an external force to save him. It's almost as if he knows he doesn't have the strength in himself to resist the dark temptations that are stirring in him. It needs to be an external influence from somebody, some love. And of course, Henry is not going to be that positive external influence. He's just going to enjoy watching Dorian become the things that he suggests to him. And we already know that Basil is probably not strong enough to take Dorian away from this dangerous path. But he realizes that even if the painting escapes the hideousness of sin, the hideousness of age will still be there for it. And in Dorian's mind, the sinfulness and the horror is just as bad as the aging, because of what Henry's told him about youth and beauty being the only thing worth having. There's another reference there to the idea of the aging of the portrait reminds him of his grandfather, who'd been so stern to him in his boyhood. As Mr. Hubbard and his assistant leave, we've got this moment where the assistant looks at Dorian, and it's described as he'd never seen anyone so marvelous. Again, this reaction that everyone has to their first meeting of Dorian. Dorian locks the door, puts the key in his pocket, and he feels safe. No one would ever look upon the horrible thing. No eye but his would ever see his shame. But he still feels moments of paranoia because he worries about his manservant Victor, who he said he would be sure to miss the picture because it's now this blank space. And he feels almost as if he's being watched. Now we know that his manservant probably won't think, give a second thought to the painting, which has now been moved. But because this is such a massive influence in Dorian's life, he's more concerned about it than perhaps he should be. And so when Lord Henry sends over a newspaper and he circled this information about the verdict of death by misadventure, in other words, it was the results of the inquest on Sybil's death. It expresses sympathy for the mother, who is greatly affected. Obviously, she had to give evidence, and she felt awful about her daughter's death. I think that's just reminding us about how little Dorian feels over Sybil's death as well. But Dorian, he doesn't want to even think about it. He tears the paper and flings the pieces away, and it's ugly. He doesn't want to think about it. Because he just wants to fill his life with beauty, and this is something he'd rather forget. Obviously, it's too uncomfortable to remember. Why dwell on things that make us feel bad? And he's angry with Lord Henry for circling it because he thought Victor might have read it. So again, this sort of pervading paranoia that's coming over him. But he tries to cheer himself up and saying, well, it doesn't matter because he didn't have anything to do with Sybil's death. This inquest tells us it's death by misadventure, and there's no mention of Dorian there, so he can breathe easy. Even though we've got this image of this poor mourning mother in our minds that doesn't seem to bother Dorian at all. He says, well, it doesn't matter because I didn't kill her. And then the last little bit of this chapter, which is quite important, it's the delivery of the yellow book that Lord Henry sends for Dorian. He sends it to Dorian to take his mind, perhaps, off the whole Sybil, unfortunate Sybil events. And it's a story about a young Parisian who spends his life trying to realize all the passions and modes of thought that belong to every century, very similar to Dorian, this pursuit of passion. And he notes that it's a poisonous book because it's kind of filled with the ideas that one shouldn't think about. But he reads on and he becomes obsessed with this book. And he's late for meeting Lord Henry, and he says, I'm sorry, but it's because the book you sent me fascinated me so. And then they talk about the difference between liking something and being fascinated by it. And Lord Henry is interested that Dorian has noticed there's a difference.